I remember when I was pretty young, I think I was in maybe 7th grade. My dad's brother was getting married in Florida. And so my dad was going to be in the wedding. And so my parents and my younger brother and I, we took a trip to Florida for my uncle's wedding. And while we were down there, we got to go to Disney. And it was something we had never done before at the time. And so we were standing outside the Disney attraction called the Haunted Mansion. And me and my mom were pretty excited to go in, but my little brother, who I'm going to say was 6 or 7 maybe at the time, he was hesitant because just how haunted is it? Just how scary is this thing? And there's no way of knowing from the outside. So my dad and my brother stayed outside, and me and my mom went on the ride. Now, there happened to be a guy there running, part of the crew that was running the ride. And I don't remember if it was me or my brother or both of us, but we had on a sweatshirt that said Gardner Tires, because that's the school district we grew up in. And the guy said to my dad, is that Gardner, Maine? And my dad said, yes, it is. And he explained that he grew up in Gardner. And he was happy to see somebody from Gardner, from his hometown down in Florida. Long story short, he took my little brother and my dad behind the scenes, and they got to see how the ride worked from the backside of things, where it wasn't so scary. And if I remember right, they even saw me and my mom going through. But it was really cool. And it's one of those things where you say, were we in the right place at the right time? Was this a coincidence that it just happened to be that we were wearing something that said Gardner, and there was a guy there from Gardner, and this cool little experience for my family? Was that luck? Was it a coincidence? I can imagine as we prepared for a trip like that, I'd be surprised if my mom hadn't been praying for us on that trip. I'd be surprised if there weren't others in our family that were praying for us on that trip. And I think God simply wanted to bless a little boy and take care of him. And I also think perhaps God was working in the life of that gentleman who perhaps needed a reminder of home and some encouragement. I don't know. We don't know who he was, and it was many years ago. But we worship a God who's not afraid to say, wait a minute, let me do this for you. The world can sometimes feel like a strange place because it's not always good. We live in a world where quite often we use the phrase, when it rains, it pours. And what we mean is that sometimes it seems like one bad thing can come after another. But then we'll also say, we were in the right place at the right time, or we were lucky. We use that phrase to describe something good. We live in this tension in the world between the good things and the bad things. And as I've heard and probably said before, the good things don't always make up for the bad things, but the bad things don't have to spoil the good things. And that is true as we live in this world. You see, we live in a fallen, sin-scarred world where it feels like sometimes it's just chaos swirling around us, where sometimes bad things happen to good people. It also, at times, feels like God is simply orchestrating everything, like the conductor of a grand symphony, just bringing everything together. And it might seem like we want to say, which is it? Is it that we live in this chaotic, fallen world where bad things happen to good people? Or is it we live in this beautiful world where God is just bringing everything together? I think the correct answer is probably both. It's both. We live in the tension between a fallen world and a loving God. And perhaps neither one of those ideas fully grasp what's taking place. Perhaps life is more like watching a child on the playground. You might go out with a little kid on the playground and you give them the freedom to make some choices. You let them run around. You let them play on the equipment. And the truth is, in all that running around and exercising all that freedom you've given them in that playground, they might scrape their knees. They might fall down. They might get hurt. They might even be swinging on a monkey bar. The monkey bars and fall and break an arm. You've given them some freedom, some free will to make some choices. And they'll make good choices and not so good choices. But you're also standing right there watching over them. You might say to the child, not so high, be careful. As they're running around, you might even say, come back this way, you're getting too close to the road. You look after the child, but you're not taking away the child's freedom to play within the playground you have placed them. And I think sometimes that's a bit what it's like with our relationship with God. God in his sovereignty has certainly given us a certain amount of free will within this sort of playground we call a world. And we live in that tension. Life is sometimes difficult, but God is always good. Last week we started looking at the book of Ruth and talking about the story of Ruth and Naomi. To kind of recap, there was a man named Elimelech. I struggle with it. This is a tough name to pronounce. Elimelech. I think that's how you say it. Elimelech was a man who was married to a woman, Naomi. They had 2 sons. There was a famine in the nation of Israel where they were from. So they went to Moab, the home of the Moabites. And there was food there. And things went okay for a while, but then Elimelech died. His 2 sons were grown and married, and they died. And so now you have this widow Naomi, and she's got 2 daughter-in-laws who are both widows. And you have these 3 widows not knowing what's going to come next. And now there's famine in Moab. Naomi knows that her daughter-in-laws are younger than her, and she knows that they have a chance to remarry. They have a chance to get their lives back on track, but she's bitter. In fact, she changes her name, she says. She tells people to basically call her bitter. And she tells her daughter-in-laws that she's returning home to Israel, but they need to leave her and just go live their lives. And neither daughter really wants to do that, but one of them, Orpah, is convinced that yes, she will return home to her family because that's what Naomi asked. But the other daughter-in-law, Ruth gives this beautiful little speech to Naomi. Ruth is incredibly devoted to Naomi. And it makes me wonder, what was it about Naomi that was so special that these young women didn't want to abandon her? Ruth tells Naomi, where you go, I will go. And where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I'll be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you from me, separates you and me. But Ruth is an amazing person. Her loyalty to Naomi is something that makes me wonder, wow, Naomi must be quite a person to inspire that kind of love and loyalty. But you know, they were still two widows going through a world in which it was tough to be a widow. Even today, it's tough to be a widow. One of the things that amazes me is we saw our friend Hazel a couple of weeks ago, and Hazel has a ministry in which she works with widows in several countries in Africa. And it's pretty amazing that her and her organization, they come alongside these women. They teach them some skills. They loan them some money so that they can set up these little micro businesses. And then they connect them together as a little community to support each other. And they give these women the hope that they can provide for their children and themselves in spite of being a widow, in a place where widows should be respected but aren't always. A place where it's simply tough to be a woman in that part of the world. For Ruth and Naomi, and thinking particularly about Ruth this week. Last week we focused some on Naomi. This week I want to talk about Ruth. Ruth was young enough that she could remarry, that's good. But there were a few things working against her as she went with Naomi back to Israel. The first thing that was going to work against Ruth was the one who was now going to be away from home. Ruth was a Moabite, a woman from Moab, in a nation which had on and off again battles and wars with the people of Moab. Moab was a country that God had spoken against, and he had actually told the people of Israel, don't become like those people, because those people were doing some things that weren't good. And so Ruth, as she went to Bethlehem with Naomi, had a few things working against her. One, she wasn't from Bethlehem. She wasn't from Israel. She was from Moab. And there was a real danger in her not being accepted by the people she was now living with. The second thing Ruth had against her was she was a woman at a time when women weren't always treated well. They weren't respected. In many places, women couldn't own property. It's why it was so devastating to be a widow. Now, who would care for a woman who had no husband? Because it was a place that made it difficult for women to care for themselves. The other thing that Ruth had working against her is, believe it or not, the culture in which Ruth lived that day, that age, that place, that part of the world was what I think we could clearly call a very sexualized culture. I think sometimes we want to apply that to our world today, and it's true. Well, we just got done reading the book of Judges. And one of the things that we see in the book of Judges is sexual violence perpetrated on men and women. It was a time in an age where they worshipped the cultures around them, including the Ammonites, or the Moabites, they worshipped different gods and goddesses, including goddesses of fertility. And as part of their religion, they embraced temple prostitution. that somehow you could be a prostitute for their God. This wasn't a really great place for a young widow. And she was a widow. She had to have missed her husband. She had to have missed the promise of children. She had to have been scared as she was now navigating life as a widow at a very dangerous time. But there were also some things that were working for Ruth. There were some things Ruth had going for her. Ruth was a hard worker. And we're going to see that in the script when we read chapter 2 this morning. Ruth was a hard worker. She had that going for her. Ruth was devoted to Naomi. She loved Naomi and she was going to care for Naomi. She had that going for her. Ruth was humble. One of the things that strikes me as we see this series, as we read through these scriptures, is that Ruth is humble enough to work hard, to help however she can, to not abandon Naomi, to do whatever it is she needs to do to take care of her and Naomi. She's humble. She has some humility. And most importantly, you know what Ruth has going for her? She has God. She has God caring for her. We think back to that speech in chapter 1 where she tells Naomi, your God will be my God. And Naomi's God, the God of Israel, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, that God cared about Ruth. He saw Ruth and Naomi's predicament, and he intervened. He was involved in their lives. Despite all the chaos swirling around them, God was there. So let's look at chapter 2. Book of Ruth, chapter 2. Now Naomi had a respected relative, a man of worth through her husband from the family of Elimelech. His name was Boaz. Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, let me go to the field so that I may glean among the ears of grain behind someone in whose eyes I might find favor. Naomi replied to her, go, my daughter. So she went. She arrived and she gleaned in a field behind the harvesters. By chance, it happened to be the portion of the field that belonged to Boaz, who was from the family of Elimelech. Just then Boaz arrived from Bethlehem. He said to the harvesters, may the Lord be with you. And they said to him, may the Lord bless you. Boaz said to his young man, the one who was overseeing the harvesters, to whom does this young woman belong? The young man who was overseeing the harvesters answered, she is a young Moabite woman, the one who returned with Naomi from the territory of Moab. She said, please let me glean so that I might gather up grain from among the bundles behind the harvesters. She arrived and has been on her feet from morning until now, and has sat down only for a moment. Boaz said to Ruth, have you understood, my daughter? Don't go glean in another field. Don't go anywhere else. Instead, stay here with my young woman. Keep your eyes on the field that they are harvesting and go along after them. I've ordered these young men not to assault you. Whenever you were thirsty, go to the jugs and drink from the water the young men have filled. Then she bowed down, face to the ground, and replied to him, how is it that I have found favor in your eyes, that you notice me? I'm an immigrant. Boaz responded to her, everything that you did for your mother-in-law after your husband's death has been reported fully to me. How you left behind your father and your mother and the land of your birth, and came to a people you hadn't known beforehand. May the Lord reward you for your deed. May you receive a rich reward from the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to seek refuge. She said, may I continue to find favor in your eyes because you've comforted me, and because you've spoken kindly to your female servant, even though I'm not one of your female servants. At mealtime, Boaz said to her, come over here, eat some of the bread and dip your piece in the vinegar. She sat alongside the harvesters, and he served roasted grain to her. She ate and was satisfied and had leftovers. Then she got up to glean. Boaz ordered his young men, let her glean between the bundles, and don't humiliate her. Also pull out some from the bales for her, and leave them behind for her to glean, and don't scold her. So she gleaned in the field until evening. Then she threshed what she had gleaned, and it was about an ephah of barley. She picked it up and went into town. Her mother-in-law saw that what she had gleaned, and she brought out what she had left over after eating her fill and gave it to her. Her mother-in-law said to her, where did you glean today? Where did you work? May the one who noticed you be blessed. She told her mother-in-law for whom she had worked, and said, the name of the man with whom I work today is Boaz. Naomi replied to her daughter-in-law, may he be blessed by the Lord, who hasn't abandoned his faithfulness with the living or with the dead. Naomi said to her, the man is one of our closest relatives. He's one of our redeemers. Ruth the Moabite replied, furthermore, he said to me, stay with my workers until they've finished all of my harvest. Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, it's good, my daughter, that you go out with his young men, so that men don't assault you in another field. Thus she stayed with Boaz's young women, gleaning until the completion of the barley and wheat harvest. And she lived with her mother-in-law. This is this amazing story. There's a lot of different things we can point out, but one of the truths I keep coming to is simply the fact that God was at work in Ruth and Naomi's life. They couldn't necessarily see it, but he was at work in their lives. Ruth had gone out to the field to glean some wheat or some barley. It was almost like the welfare system of the ancient world. A wealthy person would own a big field, and he would have men and women to go out and harvest the field and do all the work. And they would go through trying as best they could to gather and to harvest, but some would fall behind. And so they allowed the poor to come behind the harvesters and pick up any scraps, anything they missed. And that's what Ruth was willing to go out and do. That's how she was going to support herself and Naomi. So Ruth goes out to this field, and the field happened to belong to a man named Boaz, a wealthy landowner. And he just happened to be related to Elimelech. In verse 5, Boaz notices Ruth, and Boaz asked the overseers of his harvest, who does that young woman belong to? And the overseer replied, she is the Moabite who came back from Moab with Naomi. She said, please let me glean and gather among the sheaves behind the harvesters. She came into the field, and she has remained here from morning till now, except for a short rest in the shelter. Ruth was a hard worker. She came and she was working hard to try to provide for her and her mother-in-law. And it was noticed. And Boaz tells Ruth not to go to any other fields, but to keep coming back to his field, following the women who worked for him, and even drinking the water that his young men provided for his workers. And Ruth asked him, "Why are you being so kind to me?" Why are you being so kind to me? I'm telling you, there are days when that's my question for the Lord. Why are you being so kind to me? The shorter answer is because God, like Boaz in our story, offers grace. God is full of grace and truth and love. In God's case, why is he being kind? Because in his grace, he loves us. But for Ruth and Boaz, Boaz replies, "I've been kind to you because I've been told about what you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband. How you left your father and your mother and your homeland and you came to live with a people you don't know. May the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." I love that phrase. May you be rewarded, may you be blessed by the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. We serve an amazing God. We come to him. I heard a song. I was telling my wife this morning, I read something online and got a song tune stuck in my head. And I don't even know if the song's appropriate. I only know the first couple of lines that say, I was born an original sinner. I was born in original sin. If I had a dollar bill for every sin I've done, there'd be a mountain of money coming up to my chin. I don't know what the rest of the song's like, but there's some truth in that little part. We're a sinful people, born into a sinful world with a sinful nature. And God said, wait a minute. He became flesh and blood. He stepped down into our world. He laid down his life on the cross. And then he says to us, come follow me. And that is amazing. That God Almighty, the God of Israel, the God who became flesh and blood, the God who was crucified on the cross and rose from the grave, Jesus, it's under his wings we have come to take refuge. And that is amazing. Well, for Ruth and Boaz, at mealtime, Ruth was invited to eat with Boaz and his little group of people. She wasn't sent out to eat by herself. She wasn't even sent to work at the lowest on the totem pole's workers' table. She got to eat with Boaz at his table. Boaz instructed his men to leave extra grain behind. Ruth was there to gather the leftovers, the things they might miss, the things they might drop. And here's Boaz telling his people, drop stuff on purpose so she can have more. When she got home that night, Naomi was amazed at all the grain that she had brought home. Where did you work? Naomi asked. And when she hears that Ruth worked in Boaz's field, she blesses him for his kindness and tells Ruth that not only is this man kind, he's a close relative of her deceased husband, Elimelech, which also makes him a close relative of Ruth's deceased husband. Naomi remarks that this man, Boaz, is a kinsman redeemer. In one translation, it says a guardian redeemer. And we'll get more into this idea of the kinsman redeemer in chapter 3, but basically part of their culture was when a man died and he left behind a wife and he had no children, then the closest relative to that man, in what was considered at the time an act of kindness and generosity, could and perhaps should marry that woman so that she had a husband and somebody to provide for her. Somebody who would, in a sense, redeem her, buy her back. Kind of like how Christ redeems us. A little bit. We'll talk about that next week. But Boaz was a man who could change everything for Ruth and Naomi. And he does as we read as the story goes along. But here's the thing. It's amazing how Ruth's luck changes. And I use the term luck kind of with my tongue in my cheek because we know it was more than luck. It was the God of Israel under whose wings she had come to find refuge. But Ruth's circumstances change. Ruth goes to the field and she gleans, and as it turns out, it just happens to be the field's owned by a close relative of her husband. And it's one of those things where we can look at this story and go, wow, talk about being in the right place at the right time. We could say, what a coincidence. But this isn't a coincidence. This isn't luck. This is God spreading his wings around Ruth, who had pledged that he would be her God and caring for her and Naomi. Human beings can be superstitious people. You see a penny on the ground, what's the saying? Find a penny, pick it up, and all the day you'll have good luck. We can be a superstitious people. Don't walk under a ladder. You don't want to see a black cat and all these things. Sports, American sports in particular, are funny. People, if you're a fan of a team, you might wear the same shirt every time your team plays because somehow your lucky shirt might affect a game happening thousands of miles away. Athletes have been known to have lucky socks that they don't want to wash. There was a baseball player, Wade Boggs. He had to eat chicken every day that they had a game because that was just his thing. Somehow, you got to have chicken on game day. It was just kind of a good luck thing. We're superstitious people. We often use the phrase good luck when someone is making some sort of an attempt at something. Say, oh yeah, good luck with that. I do believe that sometimes there is some kind of a randomness in the world. But when God's people, praying people, are in the right place at the right time and find blessing, there is more to the story than luck. We serve a God who is active and at work in our lives. We think to the time in which the story of Ruth comes from, and many of the pagan gods worshipped during that time were gods who were considered living far away, interacting with other gods. And they would seem to be simply watching humans from a distance, as though human beings were simply their entertainment, rarely intervening. But the God of the Bible isn't like that. The God of the Bible, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God of Israel, Jesus, is different. He comes to us. He walks with us through this fallen world. And it is a fallen world. I think we get it wrong sometimes when we go to extremes that see God intentionally orchestrating every little detail in the world. But then on the other extreme, never seeing God at work at all, and that everything would be random. And those both extremes, I don't think either extreme is necessarily where we need to be. We live in a fallen world, but we serve a God who cares for us in the midst of it. I think it helps us to make sense of the tension of the world we live in, this world between God controlling everything and God controlling nothing. The tension is, it helps us to understand that in the middle, what we really have is something that we can learn by looking back at creation. If we were to look back at Genesis chapter 1, Genesis chapter 1 begins with the word, the earth is a formless void. It is darkness. It's in a sense chaos. There's nothing. And yet, in the midst of that formless void, in the midst of that darkness, it describes God's Spirit sweeping over the waters. God creates by bringing order from chaos, by bringing something from nothing. But then as we continue in the story, and we get to Adam and Eve, and we get to the disobedience of the human race. In other words, their rebellion and our rebellion against God. That's where sin comes into the world. And the effect of sin on our world is like partially undoing what God has created. It sort of brings in some of that darkness, some of that void, some of that chaos comes back into God's world. God isn't giving up on his creation. He's not surrendering control. But now that darkness has crept back into our world. And with it brought a certain randomness. Or at least what seems to us that way. The effect of sin in some ways brought a partial return to chaos and darkness. The world has this certain randomness. We see pain and hunger, broken relationships. We see abuse, suffering, sickness, and death. And all of those things were not created by God. They are a result of the sin of human beings. They're, in a sense, a sort of partial uncreation. They're a rebellion against what God was doing. They're part of the darkness and chaos from which God created the world. But God's Spirit is still sweeping over the earth, still bringing order from chaos. And the key to understanding what can sometimes seem like the randomness of the world or supposed luck, the key to understanding everything is simply this: love. God loves. That's who he is. Love can't exist without some free agency. It's an old question. Why would God allow sin? Why would God allow pain or suffering or sickness or death? C.S. Lewis describes the working of love and free will beautifully in his classic book, Mere Christianity. This is what he says. If a thing is free to be good, it is also free to be bad. And free will is what has made evil possible. Why then did God give them free will? Because free will, though it makes evil possible, is also the only thing that makes possible any love or goodness or joy worth having. A world of automata, in other words, robots, a world of automata, of creatures that work like machines, would hardly be worth creating. The happiness which God designs for his higher creatures is the happiness of being freely, voluntarily united to him and to each other in an ecstasy of love and delight, compared with which the most rapturous love between a man and a woman on this earth is mere milk and water. And for that, they must be free. God gave us freedom within his sort of playground, because he doesn't. You know how easy it would have been to simply things that would do everything he commanded, say every word he wanted, and tell him exactly what he wants to hear. But that wouldn't be love. Those wouldn't be creatures capable capable of experiencing or giving love. And with that gift that God in His sovereignty gave to human beings, the free will, it makes the best of things possible, and it allows the worst of things to creep into His creation. Humans have used the gift of free will for evil. We have brought chaos into God's creation. But God didn't abandon us. He is here with us. And because God loves us, He is willing to get involved in our lives to nudge us in the right direction. And I think that's oftentimes the best way to describe how God works in our life. He nudges us into blessing. God doesn't usually put down some kind of a big sign that says, over here, over here. It's more of a, go that way, go that way. God nudges us into blessing. Ruth and Naomi lived in a fallen world. They loved, they lost their husbands to death. But in the face of this tragedy, God did not abandon them. God heard Naomi's anguish. God saw Ruth's love and loyalty to her mother-in-law. And when Ruth set out to glean a field that morning, what follows is no coincidence. God was nudging Ruth. Over there, go to that field. Go to this one. And that heavenly nudge led her right to Boaz, a man who could change everything for her and Naomi. I think we can see God was nudging her towards Boaz. One of the things that's interesting about the book of Ruth, people will say, where is God in the book of Ruth? As we read through Ruth, there are no blatant miracles, no dreams or visions, no talk of divine wisdom or instruction. There's not even a mention of anyone praying in the book of Ruth. So people have said, where is God in the book of Ruth? God is there leading Elimelech to Moab. God is there nudging Ruth to comfort Naomi. He is nudging Naomi to comfort Ruth. He's nudging Ruth to the right field at the right time in the right place. He's nudging the people of Bethlehem to welcome Naomi home. He's nudging Boaz to be compassionate towards Ruth, reminding him of Ruth's treatment of Naomi. Where is God in the book of Ruth? He's all through it. We see clearly where God has been nudging and leading His people. And we see where it's headed when we get to the end of the book. The last few lines of the book of Ruth give us a genealogy. It says Boaz is the father of Obed, which means Ruth is the mother of Obed. Spoiler. Obed is the father of Jesse. Jesse is the father of David, as in King David. And of course, we know it's from the line of King David into which Jesus entered this world and changed everything. God Himself came into this world through the line of King David. God Himself came into this world through the story of Ruth and Boaz. Jesus' entry into this world was much more than a nudge. It was the salvation of the world by its Creator. And so we see God throughout the book of Ruth nudging people, not forcing people, but nudging them over here. Do that. And He does the same thing in our lives. It's easy for us to ask, where is God in my life? Where is He when the pain of this chaotic world is getting the best of me? The truth is, He's leading us. That's where He is. In the midst of darkness, He is there with us. He is with us. He hears our cries. He hears our prayers. He won't take away the free will He has given you. He won't take away the free will He has given anyone else. But He is present. He is active. He is the still, quiet voice in your heart that nudges you. Go this way. Trust me. Go encourage that person. God is present in the unexpected blessings of life. God is nudging us to the right time, in the right place, where we will cross paths with someone else that God is nudging to the right place and the right time. Just because we can't see what God is doing, just because we don't see big, bold, obvious things in our life, it doesn't mean that he isn't the unseen force that's protecting us and blessing us and loving us. Though Ruth may not have always recognized God's guidance, he had been there with her every step of the way. She went to glean and just happened to end up in the field of Boaz, who just happened to be a close relative. But it was more than a coincidence. It was the nudge of God. As we go about our lives, God is at work in ways we may not even notice until his word blossoms into blessing. Don't lose hope in what God can do. We should have faith that God is leading us towards him and that he has a purpose and plan for our lives. That he will never lead us or forsake us, and that the blessings we enjoy in this life are not coincidence. It's the influence of God who loves us, who whispers to us, who nudges us over here. Come follow me. Let's sing one last song as we close this morning. May the love of the Lord Jesus Christ, in whose arms you have been engulfed, may he bless you and keep you and shine his face upon you and give you strength. God bless you and enjoy your afternoon.